Mixed Media Music.
All right, welcome to Mixed Media Music. Today we will be talking about a little bit about form and narrative in Tchaikovsky's 6th Symphony. Okay, so this is kind of, I got two reasons for talking about this. First, not related to the other reason, but just I'm considering this topic is something I probably be using as a final paper topic for one of my classes. So I'm kind of airing my ideas out here. If anyone's listening to this, I'm sure you can steal my idea if you want. I've never seen this actually said, so maybe someone has made this claim somewhere, but I'm not aware of it. So I'm going to make it I'm actually going to make it a claim here about this piece. That I've never seen. Also, if you watched the show a couple of weeks ago, on one of the arguing with Reddit segments, somebody, I think one of my co-hosts here gave me a hot take from Reddit about Tchaikovsky in Sonata Form, and I responded to it a little bit there, but I feel like I want to do that a little bit more justice because it's kind of an interesting topic. So I'm going to start with that. So if we go back to this hot take from Reddit, apparently somebody had edited the Wikipedia page for Tchaikovsky to the first sentence on the section on symphonies says they edited it to say Tchaikovsky struggled with sonata form, the primary Western principle for building large-scale musical structures since the middle of the 19th century. And it's been changed back. And okay, so I responded to it there. And you can, if you want to go, after this and hear my off-the-cuff thoughts on that, you can hear that. I'm going to expand on that. Interestingly enough, too, there are a lot of people who commented on that post on Reddit. So basically, yeah, you probably shouldn't. It's a stupid thing to write, but it's also true. Okay, and I disagreed with that. So I want to explain a little bit. First off, I want to explain a little bit more in depth what sonata form is, and then we're going to apply it a little bit to this piece. And I know it's a little bit hard because copyright laws. I can't really play this piece. Okay, so when I'm done. After this, if you're watching some posts, whenever you're watching this, go and listen to the symphony. I'll drop a link, and what I can even afterwards, I'll even give Irving time stamps for in the recording what I'm talking about. Because if you don't know the piece off the top of your head, descriptions of music aren't necessarily that great. Okay, so let's look at this. I'm going to argue. Actually, I didn't argue about this at the time, but I'm gonna take issue even further back, right, with this sentence, right? So Tchaikovsky struggled with sonata form. The primary. We're gonna even ignore a second. We're gonna ignore him struggling with it. It says the primary Western principle for building large-scale musical structures since the middle of the 19th century. Well, we can historically, and that's an easy historical claim to brush aside, because sonata form develops in the end of the 18th century. Okay, so I don't know where we're getting middle of the 19th century unless this person doesn't understand how centuries work. By the middle of the 19th century, sonata form is pretty entrenched in academic writing. Okay, so Beethoven, if you think of Beethoven as, taking the classical forms, including sonata form, which is kind of like the king of forms, and Beethoven bringing it to perfection in some ways, and the ultimate grand statement and such an enormous scale by the time he gets to his 9th symphony. That's kind of like the culmination of sonata form, right? Well, that's what, 1821? Okay, so again, this claim that makes no sense. And what happens after Beethoven is that there's, the composers who are a little bit younger than him, they try to, especially in Germany, they're trying to imitate, his form, right? and like what Beethoven did with his symphonies. We get people like Mendelssohn and Schubert and Schumann. Okay, but then there's kind of a period where the symphony as a form, or as a genre, I should say, and to some extent sonata form as a form kind of falls out of fashion. And we get really programmatic music, right? It's not following a specific formal structure like sonata form. And then eventually, with people like Brahms and Tchaikovsky, we start getting later, after the middle of the 19th century, we start getting a resurgence in this, in symphonies and in sonata form, as not just an academic exercise. It had remained a really important academic tool, right? When you're teaching people how to compose, they would have you write sonata form. Okay, so that's not even true. So now, what is sonata form? Is it really the primary principle for building large-scale musical structures? I'm not sure that's how you want to define it. So what sonata form is, first off, if you're not familiar with music having form, that just means like the structure, like what ideas are placed where, and like is there a logic to that? So sonata form, as I said a couple of weeks ago, essentially what we have in a rigidly classical sonata form, we have a primary theme, okay, and that's in our home key, whatever the home key is. We have a secondary theme, okay, and the second theme is not in the same key as the primary theme. We can call it primary and secondary, or first and second, whatever. They're not in the same key. And there are rules about what key, like rigidly classical sonata form, what key the second theme can be in relation to the first key. But that's not really important. In a truly rigidly sonata, after we have theme 1 in our home key, theme 2 in a different key. In a truly rigid sonata form, and we repeat it. We go back, theme 1 in our original key, like a literal repeat. The exact same notes are played. Okay, so theme 1 in our home key, theme 2 in a different key. That's called the exposition. We're exposing our ideas, okay? Then we have a development section in which, well, that's kind of the question. Development can sort of be whatever you want, and it can be a kind of a dialectical thing where we're like theme 1 and theme 2 are kind of battling each other, which Beethoven does in a lot of his middle symphonies. It can be exploring different keys, which would be, what happened with like more in Mozart and Haydn, mostly focusing on the primary theme, the first theme in different keys. Or it can be about like organic development of these ideas, whatever that is. So that's the development. And then we get something called the recapitulation, in which we have theme 1 again in our home key, and then theme 2, but now theme 2 is in our home key. And yay, we have like resolved this harmonic tension. Everything is in our home key, and then we end. Okay, so that is what sonata form in a very rigid definition is. Okay, but if you study sonata form and form in general, what you discover is that very few things are actually written that in such a rigid manner. There are things that are, but very few things, even in the classical era, are that rigid. So by the time we get to people who are kind of bringing back the symphony as a artistic instead of an academic genre, like Brahms and Tchaikovsky, a few years later, by the time we get to them, sonata form is old, okay? And it's not strictly necessary, right? It's no longer like people like Wagner and Liszt, they had broken the hold of this thing. You don't need to use sonata form. But if you are going to use it in the first movement of your symphony, it's normally used in the first and sometimes in the last movement of a symphony or other big work. So if you're going to use sonata form, there's no reason that you have to be incredibly rigid about it, because Beethoven wasn't rigid about it. Haydn wasn't rigid with it. Mozart wasn't rigid with it. So some things that we're getting as we move into this late Romantic era, we get instant development of ideas. We may have theme 1, and before we move on to theme 2, they're going to have other themes that are other ideas that are important, but just maybe aren't like the main theme. Or we're going to get theme 1, and then theme 1 is already being like developed in some way. It's going to be very different instrumentation, fragmented, whatever. That is very common in Brahms, whom we think of as, this kind of staunch, conservative, backwards-looking classicist. No, not really. We get things like veiling of where these sections, like the development and recapitulation start. It's not evident in a Brahms symphony a lot of times. You have to like listen and keep like going back, like, wait, is that actually the recapitulation? We have more, different kinds of development. It seems to becomes less of a dialectical process of like two themes, kind of, which can be like louder than the other one, and more about like exploring areas based on these themes. And essentially, and this is not my term, but some theorists like to talk about what these people are doing, like Brahms and Tchaikovsky, is the gesture of sonata form, which is kind of having the general template that I gave you, but not strictly, making it like the keys don't work the way that they're supposed to work. Things can serve dual functions, all sorts of interesting things. But the principle of like idea and another idea as a contrast to each other, and they kind of somehow come back in a more reconciled manner, that's sort of still there. Okay, so on to Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony as an example of that. So this person who had edited the page said that Tchaikovsky struggled with sonata form, and I'll put it this way: Tchaikovsky thought that he struggled as a symphonic composer. I don't think. And he was very dissatisfied with a lot of his works, except for his Sixth Symphony. There's some other pieces he liked too, but when he wrote his Sixth Symphony, he said, I finally figured out how to write a symphony. He didn't say, I finally figured out how to write sonata forms. He could, in his early symphonies, he could, bang out a pretty rigid sonata. Okay, sonata form, as could Brahms. And Brahms is, a reasonable composer to kind of put in the same conversation with Tchaikovsky. They're writing their symphonies around the same time, and Brahms is someone who's looked on as a kind of backwards looking guy, trying to be imitating Beethoven. Well, I think if you're going to say Tchaikovsky struggled with sonata form, so to speak, I think you have to say that Brahms did too, because did he choose to write in truly rigid sonata forms? Not very often, no. I mean, there are some examples. Again, there are examples of that in Tchaikovsky's music. Okay, so Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, it's often called given the nickname Pathétique, which does not mean pathetic. It is from Russian Pateticheskaya Symphonia, which goes back to the same. It's the Latin root, passus, or suffering, right? Passion. Okay, so it's passionate and suffering, not pathetic. Also called this, not just because that's the mood of the symphony overall, but because it literally begins with the bassoon playing the beginning of Beethoven's eighth, I believe it's the eighth piano sonata, the Pathétique, same meaning, the Pathétique sonata. Okay, so we get that right off the bat. And so this symphony, it kind of has a mythic status because Tchaikovsky died, so he conducts the premiere of it and then died 2 weeks later. And not only is it kind of a really hyper-emotional symphony, but it ends in a very unconventional way. It does not, most symphonies that start in a kind of a somber, brooding minor key end, or works in general, they end in the same key, but, in a major mode, right? With some, like, kind of going back to Beethoven, right? This, like, idea of wrestling with something negative and emerging victorious over it. This symphony does not do that. It ends in a very, very sad, maybe the saddest part of the entire symphony, the last movement, is kind of all these descending lines and ends, the markings would be 5 Ps, right? So as softly as you can possibly play, just dying away. Okay, so people, literally almost immediately after he died, 2 weeks after premiering the symphony, said, wow, this piece is absolutely Tchaikovsky's suicide note. And for many years, this had been the convention, thinking about the symphony, that Tchaikovsky committed suicide afterwards, as potentially people speculated, oh, well, he was afraid that people, the government was going to find out about his homosexuality and kill him, or at very least ruin his reputation, kind of thing. He almost certainly just died of the cholera outbreak that happened to pass through at that time. That's pretty clear. But the music kind of has persuaded people of otherwise for many years. So this piece, premiered in 1893, and there are 2 other relevant pieces of information before we quickly look at the form. So the year before, Tchaikovsky is tries to write a symphony, and he gives it a program or a story. And what he says about it is that here's the outline of the story of a symphony. He says, the ultimate essence of a symphony is life. The first part is all impulse, passion, confidence, and thirst for activity. But it must be short. The finale of the first movement is death, the result of a collapse. He says the second movement is love. The third movement is disappointment. And the fourth movement ends dying away and is short. Okay. Now, this thing that he's talking about doesn't end up, the music he's writing that goes along with this description doesn't actually end up being his sixth symphony. It ends up going to other pieces. But in general, that does kind of trace the general outline of his symphony. Further, before he premiered the symphony, he was, in a really great mood. All of his relatives described him as being like the happiest they'd seen him in many, many years. He was very happy that he finally figured out, in his own words, how to write the symphony. And what he tells his nephew is that there is a story behind the symphony, but he's not going to share it with anybody. Again, when that quote comes out, added to the speculation about the symphony being his suicide note. Okay, so we're not going to dwell on whether this is a suicide note or not. I think that's kind of ridiculous. But if we look at the symphony itself, okay, we're going to mostly talk about the first movement, but we have to touch on the other movements very, very, very briefly. So we're going to look at sonata form and how it functions here, because it's not that unusual for a sonata form, with one exception. Okay, so just like its namesake, Beethoven's Pathetique piano sonata, which, the quote from that opens up both, that piece and the symphony, that in the Beethoven piece is kind of non-functional. It's not part of the sonata form. It's just kind of this really passionate introduction. It's kind of the same thing in this symphony, but some of the material from it becomes the first theme. So we get that kind of idea. We get the first theme, which has some connection to it, and that's kind of it's not terribly lyrical. It's kind of really fast moving, kind of dark and jittery. When we get to the second theme, okay, and here this is what's interesting to me. So the second theme, we get this really, really long lyrical melody in the strings. Then we get a section inside of it, okay? So we have like this melody, and the melody will come back. Before the second theme melody comes back, inside of there, we have this really interesting moment for all the woodwinds, solo woodwinds. They're all just kind of running up scales in a sort of melodic fashion, okay? So we have, again, for our second theme area, we have like the second theme melody, this interesting inner, kind of intimate woodwind line, this ascending, descending line thing. And then the entire orchestra is going to play the second theme melody very emphatically. Okay. And that's, again, nothing too terribly unusual, I would say, that we have these two ideas, although, sandwiching them maybe is a little bit strange, but nothing too out of the ordinary. But so as this second theme kind of dies away, we get this very, very violent section, which is our development, okay? And really, violence is the only word I can come up with to describe it. The end of the second theme ended as quietly as possible, with just the bassoon playing at one note, as again, instruction as quietly as you can possibly play. Then suddenly gives massive, like chord in the orchestra. Very startling. Again, it's kind of violent music for the development. And then at the kind of we go back, we get our first theme again. Then we build up to another climax before we reach the second theme. And at this big climax, the brass starts playing a quotation from the Russian Orthodox funeral liturgy. So again, also adding to speculation for people, for even today, that again, this is his suicide note. Again, disregarding that. Then we get the second theme. The orchestration is very different. It's not this full, multi-octave, really rich scoring of the second theme, but we get the second theme. What we're missing, though, is that we get the second theme, and then we get the second theme with a little bit fuller sound, but not as full as before. We're missing this inner part where these woodwinds are doing this kind of, these intimate moment. These woodwinds are doing these runs. Okay, and that's sort of interesting because it's not a necessary part of the form, but why would you? But it seems like it is equally important, right? And I'm not that first. That's not like people have remarked on that. That's nothing too novel. The one writer I really like kind of refers to it though in an interesting way, but I think it's kind of backwards. You'd think that this like the second theme area is kind of like if you think of it like an egg, like we have this this shell and then this really tender thing on the inside. Then we get the violence of the development. And you think if the violence is going to do any harm in any way to this really beautiful second theme, it's going to smash the outside of the egg, but maybe some, this really delicate core inside will remain. But it's the opposite. The outside is what remains, and the inside is gone. And other writers have said, well, that's interesting because this is Tchaikovsky not being too sentimental. He has something really beautiful, but it's gone, and he doesn't try and regain it. My contention, though, is that is not true. So I think the way I've been looking at this piece recently is that what happens to this really tender kind of ascending and then gently descending line that doesn't come back. And to me, I think that this is where this narrative, whether it's like the secret narrative that Tchaikovsky talked about, or kind of related to the narrative he gave for the pieces, kind of loosely became this piece. To me, this is where the story is. Whatever this like inner part is that doesn't come back is something really important. And there's some violence, something catastrophic that happens musically. It's not recovered, but I don't think that Tchaikovsky just lets it go. To me, when I listen to the beginning of the second movement, the main theme of the second movement, which is kind of his broken waltz, instead of being in 3/4, like 2 bars in 3/4, it's a 3+2, so it's in 5/4. So it's kind of like a waltz, but it's awkward. It's missing part of it. You can't fully do your waltz dance. The melody of this second movement is not exactly the same as the melody for this, intersection of the second theme and the first movement. It is not exactly the same, but to me, their contour is very similar. We got this kind of longer ascension and then slightly going down. Okay, it's not exactly the same, profile, but it's very pretty much the same. It doesn't go like exactly the same, like way up and way down. But to me, I think that it's the gesture. It's the same gesture, and to me, the way I look at it, I think this gesture is still there. And just it can't live in the same way that it did when it was first presented in the first movement. It is kind of He's trying to regain it in this kind of stilted waltz. And we can look even more carefully if you want to. This second section of this 5/4 broken waltz is also kind of related to the this inner section of the second theme of the first movement. And in some ways, I think the last movement, our main theme, this descending line, is, to me, I think, just in an inversion of this idea. The idea has now been so thoroughly defeated and broken, and then it's just going to sink down in the opposite way. Instead of going up and then gently falling down, it's just going down. You can feel free, if you know the piece or not. You can go listen to it too. You can feel free to completely disagree with that analysis. But at least to me, even if these things aren't literal, I think the gestures are there. And I think that's where the story of this piece is. So, it's kind of tied into this sonata idea, right? Where we're not getting this intersection coming back. It doesn't resolve. And to me, it does continue, in broken fashion, and then so thoroughly broken that it reverses itself at the end of the symphony. So again, that's my feeling about it. Personally, feel completely different. You think I'm absolutely crazy, that I'm just making something up there about how the melody continues throughout the symphony. But I think that gives us some sense of like what this story is. It's not I can't put words to it, what story Tchaikovsky had in his mind with his symphony, like he claimed to have. But I do think that to me, that's where something about this piece lives. So yeah, that's a little bit more detail on sonata form, whether Tchaikovsky could write a proper sonata. I think this pretty much fills at least the gesture of it, right, of sonata form. And also, I'm putting my idea about this symphony, putting it out there for the first time. So, yeah.
Well, you see, so you write a comment on Reddit, get a reaction, and then we get a whole episode in response. So that's pretty cool. Awesome. I assume we'll hear more about Tchaikovsky in the future, so definitely subscribe.
He's always an important composer. So I don't know. I think he can write sonata form. So that's my really broad conclusion.
Yeah, for sure.
Look, tell a man no trouble. I don't want beef, man. I just want vibes. Big man like me, no need for the telephone hype. I got too much getting online. One rule, then dead I'm on site. Wrong move, I bet they gon' ride. No need for the telephone hype, nah. No need for the snoozing. Big whip outside, I'm cruising. Big stick inside, no losing. Better watch out for the snake and Judas is. Don't ask them who this is. I bet they know what I'm moving in. I bet I show it into a dim. How you hate and then lose again? How you hating my vibes? Why you wasting my time? Getting hype on my line. Tell a man I don't want feedback, I just want relax. Brand new whip, two-tone, I need that brand new hit. Like lean back, brand new bits I live in. We back, man, you never gon' like us. Get them on sight now, let them on light. That way they know I'm more righteous. Look at my life, I'm living alright. I'm nice, you know I'm alright. Cause looking like Christ, no need for the hype or fight or telephone vipers. No need for the telephone vipers.